Hello, welcome to the next episode of Bike Psych. So, something really bad has happened, you've had a bad experience, maybe you've lost a job, you've been rejected for something. Why is it sometimes we can kind of cope with that and sometimes we can't? So today the subject is resilience. Okay, so a subject that's long been a puzzle for psychologists is why do some people cope or manage to cope with the most horrific things in their lives, and then other people seem to struggle at what might objectively be described as less serious, such as some people manage to cope with concentration camps during the war or POW camps, and others of us are not able to cope with, let's say, a marriage breakup or something, which, although clearly very traumatic, you wouldn't sort of say was necessarily at the same level. So it's a really interesting area, and there's a paper that I've taken a lot of this material from, and the paper's author is Coutu. I should say it's perhaps not so much a paper as an article in the Harvard Business Review. Now, I came across this because I was asked to do some work on resilience with a little team within a university. So they asked me to do a little bit of a workshop with them. So I spent a day with them on resilience, and this was part of my research for that. So I dug it out and I thought, well, I'll have a little look, because now's a time when I guess we kind of all need resilience to a degree, and I'm recording this in May of 2020. I probably don't need to say much more. We're coping with, I suppose, quite a lot of worry, both in terms of health worries and simply in terms of worry about our living, whether we've got a job to go back to, and so on. So it's a pretty difficult time for many of us, and so resilience is certainly a quality that I guess we'll all be looking for. So I thought now would be a good time to talk about that. It's also an interesting point personally, because as you know, I'm kind of half of Evil Sheep. I'm the less important half. It's my daughter's business really, but we make films and we write and so on. And we had applied for some funding, which we were really hopeful for. We got through to the very final round, the last 7 as it happened. So we'd already got through some hoops, and we had an interview. The interview went very well, we thought, and so we're pretty positive, but we got a rejection on that particular bit of funding, which would have been really great, and there would have been some development for Celine. So we're pretty disappointed, and so that was the reason I thought, resilience is a good subject to think about for us all, really. On the one hand, we've got a worldwide pandemic affecting millions, and on the other, there's a very personal thing that's kind of knocked, I suppose, our confidence a bit. So I thought resilience is a good subject. So back to Diane Coutu's article. So her article is called, I think it's called How Resilience Works. Now I guess there's always a problem with definitions when it comes to these sorts of subjects, and I don't want to get too hung up on that. I think there is a misunderstanding of what it means though. So there was a football manager called Ian Dowie, English football manager, soccer, if you're in America, and he kind of coined this phrase just off the cuff, really. He said we had to have a lot of bounce back ability, and that sort of merging lots of words into one became a bit of a catchphrase of his, bounce back ability, and he became famous for it. I think he even started a charity to help people with mental health problems. And it's not a bad phrase, it's a good phrase, but the problem with it is it tends to make you think of like somebody who's very strong, and it doesn't matter what you do to them, they just keep bouncing back like a ball hitting a wall with no impact upon them. And from most research we've found that that's not really what resilience is at all. It's much more complicated than that. So just a thick skin and like an indefatigable attitude is not necessarily going to give you resilience. So according to Diane Coutu, there were 3 things that she identified in her research that seemed to signify resilience in somebody. I'll just quickly list them and then we'll look at each one in a bit more detail. So the first one was that they, in her words, resilient people face down the truth or face down reality. So we'll talk a bit more about what that means, but I suppose what it's saying there is it's not just about wide-eyed optimism, it's actually about engaging with the world as it is, not necessarily how we'd like it to be. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. The second element relates to the ability of some people to find meaning and purpose in life, and even in events or things that are happening to them that are particularly unpleasant. And so that seems to be related to resilience. People that are able to find meaning and purpose in life. And finally, the importance of adaptability. So that third one I'm going to talk about a little bit more, because it uses a concept, or she mentions a concept that I've come across in lots of different areas called bricolage. So if there is a subtext to this Bike and Psych, it's the usefulness of bricolage. What is it and how to be a bricoleur? Okay, so let's have a look at these in order then. So the first one of these is that people who are resilient tend to face down reality. Let's put it this way, they engage with reality. So they don't live in a make-believe world where their sheer optimism makes them believe that everything is just going to be magically fine and that they're going to get what they want tomorrow, or that it's going to drop in their lap, or even that this injustice is going to go away because of the natural justice in the world. So people who are, I suppose, dwell in reality, they seem to be better at coping with things that happen to them. I suppose it's that feeling that of terrible shock and surprise that you can't believe that this bad thing's happening to you because you're so optimistic about life. And so it's that kind of shock and surprise that probably makes it worse. She quotes on a couple of occasions actually people who have experienced life in prisoner of war camps, and she notes that those survivors tend to say that it was the wide-eyed optimists who unfortunately didn't make it. So are we saying that optimism is a bad thing? Well, of course not. Optimism is a good thing, but I guess there's a limit. There's a level of engagement with reality that whilst, yes, we want to be optimistic about the future, we don't want to be extreme in our negative analyses, we still need to be engaging in reality. I should make the point that psychologists of some ilk, not all, but some would have a problem with this idea of reality itself, especially social psychologists, social scientists, who see the social world as constructed, which of course it is in many cases. The whole concept of reality is problematic. How can you say what reality is? And so, yeah, I don't really want to get sucked down that wormhole today, rabbit hole, so I'm not going to. It's more of a philosophical question. I think we can all understand what we mean when we talk about reality. It's the world that most of us share, and that we interact with. So yeah, I guess bringing it to the current situation, if you're somebody who believes that, you know, virus, what virus? It's nothing wrong, it's same as normal, it'll be gone within a week, you know, you're going to struggle because it's not what all the data says. It's not what reality is. So I guess that can be a problem if you're not accepting reality. That doesn't mean that you lie down and die, it just means that you engage with the world as it is, not how you want it to be. Okay, so I hope I've got the nuance right there. I can imagine people saying, well, you know, you've got to have positive thinking and all that. Yeah, you do, absolutely, I agree, but it has to be rooted in something that could happen and maybe that you can influence. Alright, second one then is this idea of meaning and purpose in life. So people who are resilient somehow are able to find meaning and purpose in life, and that means that they're able to have a kind of value system that can place in context what you're going through. And that's a really difficult one, I think. So when you're in the middle of something bad that's happening to you, I'm afraid someone else saying to you, well, you know, there's always a reason. So everything happens for a reason. I don't know about you, but I personally hate that saying. However, somehow you need to be able to find a purpose and meaning in what is happening to you. And I think the best example of this is Viktor Frankl, who essentially invented a whole new type of therapy called meaning therapy. He was a prisoner of war, and actually he may have been in the concentration camp. I need to clarify that. So he was experiencing horror, really, I guess on a scale that most of us thankfully will never experience. And at one point he realised how meaningless he felt his life was in this horror, just simply existing day by day, getting through each day. So what he did, he started to imagine himself as a lecturer, standing in front of people, talking about his experience and explaining how he'd managed to cope with life, and how he managed to overcome or get through such horror. So he invented meaning therapy, and the fact that he could do that was the meaning that he needed. So he needed to survive because he needed to be able to invent this therapy and talk to other people about it. What a fabulous example of meaning finding in the most hideous of circumstances. So I don't want to use cliches, you know, like learning from your mistakes, or, you know, the importance of experience and all that. But of course, you know, I talk now about experiences when I was made redundant, what it did for me, how it forced me to start my own business during the last recession, and so on. And I think at the time it's very difficult, and no one can sort of say to you, you know, look for the good in it, and that's not, kind of not the purpose. The meaning can be found in learning how to cope, passing on that wisdom, if you like, and experience, or indeed anything else. It doesn't really have to be that. Of course, it could be anything that matters to you. Alright, so that's 2 out of the 3 categories or characteristics: engaging with reality, facing it down, and finding meaning. And the third one is this ability to be adaptable. So what does this mean? Well, this is one that I find most interesting. So at the first glance, adaptability doesn't necessarily shout resilience to me, but when you start to think about it, you can really see the link. So if you're somebody who's kind of adaptable, able to cope with change, and the way you do that is by finding new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, new ways of being, then this is a really kind of powerful, maybe it's a superpower, I don't know, but it's a powerful way to cope with the ever-changing world that we live in. And so I think that's a very useful talent. Now, in her article she talks about bricolage. Now, bricolage is a word that I'd never heard of 2 years ago, and then I started to do a master's in organisational psychology with Birkbeck, University of London, which I've really enjoyed, by the way. Recommend it. And I read a number of different papers in different subjects, really, that kept mentioning this word, or this term, bricolage, and people who practice bricolage as being bricoleurs. And what it was this is a French word where sort of French tinkerers, junk collectors, would find bits of junk that nobody else wanted. Sometimes very simple bits like wire and bits of thread and wood and scraps of metal and things, and they would use that stuff to construct something else. So basically it's the craft of being able to find bits and bobs and cobble together something of value from a disparate set of things that are not necessarily related, but that you make into something. And that has two senses. It has a practical sense, so you can imagine a bricoleur finding bits and bobs. Oh, I'm just watching a kite there, fantastic. You can imagine a bricoleur finding bits and bobs and putting them all together and making something. But you can also imagine the use of, and this is where the psychology bit comes in. So in psychology there's this idea called sense making. I've talked about it a lot on my Bike Psych, and the idea is that human beings observe, if you like, or experience the world through their senses, but then they have to make sense of that in terms of what is it, what does it mean, what's my relationship to it, what is this an example of, how do I frame this, how do I make sense of it. And of course people do that in different ways, and that's why two people can look at the same situation but make completely different sense of it, come to different conclusions. So we are all sense makers, and for bricolage in this term, a sense making bricolage would be kind of cobbling together bits and pieces that help to make sense of something that maybe before made sense to you but now it doesn't. So you have to cobble together tropes, sayings, axioms, ideas, proverbs, values, beliefs that have come to you from maybe lots of different places, and you cobble them together into a new way of making sense of what's just happened to you. And I think that's really relevant today. So, you know, you may have had a completely different outlook on the world 3 months ago, and this new way of experiencing the world could be really difficult. But bricolage means making sense of this new reality in a way that you're able to get some coherence and to tell a story that makes sense to you. So that's bricolage, and I think it's fascinating. It's a really interesting idea. So they're the three areas that Diane Coutu identified as being rich in people who are resilient by nature, is that they have these three things. One, they face down reality. They don't live in a make-believe world. Oh yeah. They don't live in a make-believe world. They engage with reality. 2, they're able to find meaning and purpose in life, even in parts of life that are painful and difficult. They find meaning in that. And 3, that they're bricoleurs. They're able to cobble together a way of making sense of the situation, to find some narrative that they can be part of and they can kind of talk about in a way that makes sense to them in particular. Right, so that's Coutu's paper. I'm briefly going to mention a couple of other things before I finish. One of those is, and I'm going to go back to this idea of sense making, is a bit of research that was done around why it is that, or how it is that people cope with maybe being made redundant or some other traumatic event in their life. And this research interviewed a number of people using semi-structured interviews. So that's kind of, they have some questions, but you know, they're still able to ask subsidiary questions. Okay, so I've just climbed up that hill. So I live in Peterborough, which, if you know Peterborough, you'll know it because it's very flat, or at least it is on one side. On the other side of Peterborough, towards the north, it's not exactly hilly, but there are 1 or 2 hills on a bike, and there's one particular feature I think runs across a few miles. So it doesn't matter which way you go, kind of out of Peterborough that direction, you're always going to crop up on that hill. So I'm just getting my breath back now. So while I'm doing this, I might as well just talk a bit more about this paper. So yeah, this paper was, I thought, really interesting. Right, I'm going to move. And it's, as I say, it looked at people who had suffered some trauma in their lives. In fact, there's a couple of papers that are similar. And one was a Marine who lost his legs in an incident, and it meant he obviously couldn't do the job he trained for, and his identity was caught up in that. You can imagine that was so difficult. He'd always wanted to be a soldier. He was a Marine. He had, you know, pride in his achievements and in his position, in his job, what he did, and now he couldn't do that anymore. And of course impacted on him and his identity. There's other people who lost jobs, you know, people who had maybe had to take redundancy or been made redundant after a long time, you know, in their 50s, they suddenly found themselves on the dole. So that was a difficult situation for them too. So you can imagine that these experiences were very difficult. What the research found was that narrative had a really important part to play. So this goes back to that third element of I suppose, bricolage, is that the way that people were able to construct a narrative around their lives really mattered. So for people whose story kind of ended in a full stop, you know, so that's it now, I have nothing, they struggled to cope with what had happened to them. On the other hand, people who just saw it as a setback, difficult to cope with, but nevertheless just part of their life that they would move through and so on. Now that might be time that allows you to do that, but what this research found is that whatever time you're able to do that, people who are able to make that shift, I suppose, from, you know, the end of the line, this is the end of everything, what's life for, because my purpose has gone, my meaning has gone. People who felt that way really struggled, whereas people who were able to kind of just weave it into their bigger story were able to cope with that setback and seem to be able to show more resilience. So we're going to come back here to this narrative, the way that we make sense of our lives through narrative and story. So what's our story? And I think that does make a big difference. Okay, so I guess I've covered the main bits. I've got a feeling there's a paper that I wanted to talk about that I've forgotten. If that's the case, I apologise. I might put it on the description anyway. But that's it, I think. I suppose the final word to say is, what about the practicalities of this? So if you've just been, dumped by your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or if you've lost your job because of the virus, or if your business is going bust for whatever reason, or you've just been rejected by an arts council to fund you for some money, whatever's happened, how do you gain resilience? Well, I'm a great believer that knowledge is helpful. So by keeping in mind those three elements I mentioned from Coutu's work, just engage with reality, and that's also not just being mindlessly pessimistic either. So our rejection wasn't because we were rubbish, it wasn't because we had nothing to offer. We got through to the last 7, so that was great, but we didn't get it for some reason. So okay, what's that? So let's find out. Let's engage with reality. Let's talk to them. Let's find out what it was that they felt meant that we weren't quite ready at this point, and we'll put it right for next time. Okay, I'm just slowing down to let a car pass. Okay. So we're engaging with reality there. We're not going to pretend that it was all their fault. We're great. On the other hand, we're not useless, we're not rubbish, because we got through to the last 7. Same for you if you've broken up with a boyfriend or girlfriend or partner or a marriage. It's not that everything about you is bad. Maybe nothing about you is bad. Just engage with reality, and it's very unlikely to be an extreme. Secondly, look for the purpose and meaning in life, and that's hard. I personally think an overarching purpose in life is maybe too big an ask, and it's something that you have to do throughout your whole life. I'm not sure I've found that personally yet. Maybe I have, I just don't know it. But I'm happy to engage in the journey. But certainly for individual circumstances, individual things that happen, you can find some meaning in that, and purpose in that, and some value, even if it's a hideous thing that you're experiencing. And that's not to undermine or belittle what you may be going through in any way. And the third point in Coutu's article was this sense of being a bricklayer. Find ways to cobble together a way of understanding and making sense of your life. And there's also some very practical elements of bricolage too, where you can think about the skills that you have and the experience you have that you could apply to another area, another career, another relationship, another hobby, another way of life. So yes, you may have lost that particular role in that particular job, but you've still learned a lot along the way which you can apply in other things. So that's some very practical stuff that I think we can take from that. So resilience. I've remembered the other bit I was going to talk about, which came from my research for the university, and that was the value of caring relationships. Now remember, this is a organisational development thing, and the paper I read this in was about organisational resilience. So this isn't really particularly, this paper wasn't particularly about personal relationships, and yet it really did emphasise the value of caring relationships in this setting, in the workplace. But of course those caring relationships apply in whatever setting you have. So I thought it was really interesting. And part of the exercise that I did with the uni was thinking about how they can support each other through their own experience and feelings around change and difficult times. I suppose as a final note, there is something here around individual differences. I've talked about individual differences on another Bike Psych, which you might want to check out. So some people are more given to resilience than others because of their nature. But the evidence suggests that you can learn these qualities. So whilst you might not be born with natural resilience, you can learn these ways of thinking that I described to you. So I hope that was useful. So thank you very much for listening to Bike Psych. Bike Psych is part of the Evil Sheep YouTube channel. It's very eclectic. There's lots of different stuff on there. My daughter does stuff about cooking and lifestyle stuff, I suppose. I do my Bike Psych, and I'm also doing a series on my own journey and out of the Jehovah's Witnesses and how I personally managed to cope with that. So I guess people who have been through something like that would recognise that maybe as requiring resilience, not pretending that it wasn't difficult in any way. Anyway, that's another one of the series that's part of the Evil Sheep channel, so please do subscribe.